Good morning, everybody. It's good to see everybody here, and it's good to see you, Ni, as well. Sorry for casting you. Very briefly, I'd just like to be speaking on what I termed divine ontology and the historicity of the Bible. Now, keep in mind that Pastor IG had already said some things about, positing causal relations, what caused what, that, the experience, empirical observation. I should. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry for jumping the gun, sorry. My name is Mohammed, Sule, as, you've likely seen on the flyer. And very quickly, I'll be speaking on divine ontology and the historicity of the Bible. So, if, for instance, our daily observation and empirical knowledge that we have about the conception of the world, everything around us, phenomenology, and so on and so forth, tells us that nothing comes into being out of nothing, so to speak. I remember one of the questions I asked ChatGPT when everybody was just, posing questions. I'm like, what's the greatest existential question that has ever been posed to man? And ChatGPT, of course, would reply that I think the most greatest existential question is, why is there something rather than nothing? And as somebody who has read a lot of philosophy, particularly from medieval philosophy to 20th century philosophy, I think that answer is pretty much consistent. Now, the first argument, I'll be positing a lot of arguments. I think basically two arguments. I will expound on them. And before that, I'm going to talk on how we can go from, what caused what, how the universe had a beginning, and then transit onto Christianity. So first of all, I'm going to argue for theism, very briefly, that is, belief in God. And then from that, I'm going to, posit how we can transit from that onto Christianity in particular. Now, the first argument I'm going to posit is a very popular argument, particularly in philosophy of religion. This is what's called the Kalam cosmological argument. The Kalam cosmological argument. It was first, posited by Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali is a Muslim philosopher in the 9th century. But this argument was so powerful that William Lane Craig, he's a very popular apologist, would later work on this argument, and then he would popularize this argument. For anybody who is familiar with Christian apologetics, sure knows the Kalam cosmological argument. And it's pretty simple, and it goes like this, that whatsoever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, we know from experience, like I stated earlier, that whether it's something as very simple as a Nike shoebox, for instance, or something as intricately, mind-blowingly complex as a space rocket, we know that they did not pop into existence. Let's imagine that you were walking in a forest now, and then you saw a very shiny stone with a lot of intricacies inside. And maybe I told Sammy now that Sammy asked, why is there a stone here? And then I simply responded that, it just is. It's just there. And, you don't need any sort of explanation for it. Now, let's imagine this stone to grow to the size of the earth. And let's imagine this stone or this orb to grow to the size of the universe. That does not mean that it should not require an explanation in and of itself, so to speak. And William Lane Craig has defended this Kalam cosmological argument very strongly. Matter of fact, there had been a reassessment in 2018, and then the verdict is that the Kalam cosmological argument is still tenable as as an argument for the existence of God. Now I'm going to go to the next slide, which is the Leibnizian cosmological argument. I think this is where I'm going to spend a considerable amount of my time. Now, the first one says that anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. 3, the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has an explanation for its existence. Now, I'd like to go to the next slide before I come back to the Leibnizian cosmological argument. And that's the principle of sufficient reason. Now, the cosmological argument was propounded by Leibniz, all right? He was a mathematician and a logician as well. And what Leibniz says, as this thing implies, is that he called it the monad. Monad is simply unit for me and you now are monads. I mean, the water bottle is a monad, the plants, the trees, the sun, every single thing are composite properties of what make up the entire universe. Now, what Leibniz says is that for every monad, there is a principle of sufficient reason that is warranted. It means that there has to be an explanation for every monad, because as it is implied in the Kalam cosmological arguments, nothing can come out of nothing. We cannot have a spontaneous generation of complex beings or complex things or complex matter. So let those little boxes, I think about 8, let those little boxes represent every monad that we know in the universe. Now, Leibniz says that there is a sort of interconnected set of explanation that we can have for the monad, all right? It means that the Earth or the solar system now, the planets are all dependent on the sun. If I were to snap my fingers and the sun disappeared, there would no longer be the solar system, so to speak. For instance, I am dependent on oxygen to breathe, all right? And the plants utilize my carbon dioxide as well. So in the complex set of things, you see that contingent beings are dependent on each other for their survival. Such that if you took away some certain categories, if you took away certain categories, those things would cease to exist. But what Leibniz goes on to say is that out of every one of those monads, if you were to bring them collectively together, that is the universe, what would be the explanation for the universe itself? That is the collection of monads, to the Leibnizian cosmological argument. That's why Leibniz then goes on to say that anything that exists has an explanation for its existence. That is, we all have explanations for our existence. 2, the universe has an explanation for its existence. So Leibniz said, the universe began to exist. 4, therefore, the universe has an explanation for its existence. Therefore, the explanation for the existence of the universe is God. Now, how do we know it is God? I mean, why can't we posit something else, isn't it? And what we know is that there are certain properties that this being, so let's not call it God at this particular moment. Let's call it the cause or the entity, or let's just call it the cause. Now, because if the cause is supposed to bring the universe into existence, there are certain properties that this cause has to possess, all right? And this is what Leibniz calls the necessary and we being contingent. So it means that this cause has to be necessary. For instance now, next slide. The necessary nature of the causal agent. Now, this cause would have to be uncaused, first of all, because it caused the universe to be existing. Now, why does it have to be uncaused? Now, it is so because it caused the universe to be at the end of the day. And one might say, okay, if this cause has to be uncaused, then why can't the universe be uncaused as well? Or why can't the universe be eternal in and of itself? But that's why Leibniz would then come in and say that, well, we are talking about contingent beings. The universe is contingent. This being is necessary. Why? Because it created time, space, and the universe. And if it created time, space, and matter, then it automatically follows that this being or this cause would exist outside of time, space, and matter. And if it exists outside of time, space, and matter, then it means that it logically follows that we can say this being is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. If it's timeless, then it means that it is eternal or infinite. If it is spaceless, it is also infinite in all its capabilities as well, because it created space and it created time, so to speak. And then it automatically follows that this being would have to have unimaginable power. And power in physics is simply the ability to do work, right? And so we know that this being caused the whole universe to exist in its entirety. So, of course, it automatically follows that this being has to be unimaginably powerful as well. And 6, finally, it says that this being will also have to be personal and intelligent. We're saying personal because us as monads or us as contingent beings possess intelligence and we possess personality. And following the principle of analogy, a being cannot give the properties that it does not possess, so to speak. So if we have or possess consciousness and we have moral aptitudes, then it automatically follows that this being itself would possess those properties. And if we are finite and that being is infinite, then it means if he knows, then it means that it must be all-knowing because it is infinite. If it comes to, this being does not come to be because we come to be. So it means it automatically follows also that this being will be omniscient, he will be powerful, he will be infinite, and, transcend time and space, so to speak. And of course, there is scientific evidence. The next slide. There is scientific evidence, of course, to back this up, and it is from the Big Bang theory. Now, of course, there is the evidence for the expanding universe. Now, Georges Lemaitre, that's the Belgian priest, once observed that the universe began to, expand at some point in time. And then he would call this the hypothesis of the primeval atom. And then Edwin Hubble, who the Hubble telescope is named after, also noticed, the redshift expanding. And then their deduction ultimately is that the universe has been expanding, so to speak. And then that was in the 20th century. And then in the 21st century, 2003, 3 astrophysicists and theoretical physicists, Borg, Good, and Vilenkin, posited a theorem, and the theorem is that, and the theorem demonstrates that any universe that has on an average been expanding throughout its history cannot be finite in the past, but must have a space-time boundary. In essence, what we're saying is that the universe must have a beginning. And what the Big Bang theory has demonstrated that the universe indeed does have a beginning. But of course, we're not saying that because the universe has a beginning, then the Big Bang theory automatically proves that there is a God. But rather, what we're saying is that the Big Bang theory simply shows that the universe has a beginning. We then use logic, inference, and philosophy to deduct that, of course, things cannot come to be uncaused, so to speak. I mean, mathematics is a representation of our universe. And we know from mathematics that 0 times 0 is what? 0, so to speak. And that brings us automatically into theism. From the next slide, we can see the history of the universe from the Big Bang till this contemporary period that we are. But ultimately, that only brings us, like I said, to theism. It does not bring us to Christianity now, for instance, or it does not bring us to Islam, for instance. It just brings us to theism. Next slide, please. And so, why Christianity? Because we've got to answer that question. It doesn't bring us to the Christian God, I beg your pardon. It brings us to theism, but it doesn't bring us to the question, to the Christian God. Why Christianity? Now, with this kind of arguments that I've posited, we are going to have to because people generally say when you're arguing for God, people might say, okay, which God? I mean, there are over 40,000 gods, all right? So when you say that you are arguing for God, which particular God are you arguing for? Are you arguing for Thor, or are you arguing for Zeus, or Hermes, or Mercury? Which one? But I think that this question misses, the narrative. And I'll try to point it out. First of all, the worldview that I express does not apply to the polytheistic worldview, and I'll say why. There are 2 reasons. First of all, relativism. We know that truth is not relative. If truth is that which is consistent with reality, ultimately. So I cannot have my truth and you can't have your truth. We can't all choose what we want, but we must be consistent with what the truth says. So, and we know that every religion makes a truth of exclusivism. That is, I am the way through which you can, see God, or I am the way through which you can come to Valhalla, or, so on and so forth. And then, second of all, metaphysical relativism. Metaphysical relativism as well. Now, for instance, if you were to die now, are you going to Valhalla, or are you, going to, Olympus, or particularly, are you going to dwell with them, Songo, or because every civilization has its own pantheon, all right? I think Pastor IG said something very poignant. It is that it seems as if man always has the ability to create God or his God in his own image. For instance, we see that Songo is black. For instance, we also see that Thor, is blonde and he has yellow hair and so on and so forth. Almost when you look across civilizations and you see their gods and their pantheons, it looks like some representation of them. But the Christian God is not particularly whom we're talking about, because we see that the Christian God is transcendent, he's timeless, he's spaceless, he's immaterial, and he is infinite, most of all. And so what this does is that it brings us to monotheism, that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So what we'll now have to do is we'll assess the option very quickly. First of all, Judaism. Now, Judaism is a very, very complex religion. And, to talk about it might take, the entire day or 8 weeks even. But thankfully, we can sum up Judaistic belief into 2 certain tenets. The first of all is ethical monotheism. And the second of all is the eschatological hope of a messianic kingdom. That is, we are expecting a Messiah to come and redeem us from our oppression, to come and redeem us from the Roman Empire and, from the Persian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. So they always had this expectation of, a Messiah that is to come. And Jesus Christ not only fulfills the messianic prophecies, but rose again. And if this man rose again, then it means that we should pay attention to what he has to say. And across all scripture, or the Jewish scripture, which we know as the Tanakh, Jesus Christ ascribes all this scripture to himself, saying that I am the very Messiah that you had awaited for several centuries. And Jesus died and he rose again. Next slide. And then it brings us down to Islam, second of all. So what makes Islam not tenable? I think the idea, first of all, is Islamic fatalism. And what Islamic fatalism simply espouses is that, it's not like the demons rebelled, or it's not like Satan rebelled. God himself creates Satan, or God himself creates Shaitan, as it is called, and God creates the demons himself. He created the angels from light, and then he created the demons from a flame of fire. And God ultimately, as some of the Quranic verses that I cited implied, not even implied, explicitly states that God determines every single thing, not in the Christian sense, but in the literal sense. So, for instance, as you are looking at me, I'm likely thinking some things in your mind. Those very thoughts that just came up in your mind, God had already predetermined those thoughts. I think in Sahih al-Bukhari, book 82 and hadith 1, it shows us that from the 40 days after a person's conception, I think I was sharing this with some people not so long ago, 40 days after a conception, God sends an angel and dictates every single thing. I'm talking even on a subatomic level. He dictates every single thing that you are going to do, the words that you are going to say, when you are going to die, in particular. Matter of fact, the sins that you are going to commit. For instance, I'd just like to cite something where if there's a particular dua you say as a Muslim. For instance, if you go to a person's house, you have to recite a certain dua, a prayer. And the prayer is that if you go to a person's house who is bereaved, the prayer that you're supposed to say is that, okay, thanks be to God who has saved me from this calamity and then has brought it upon you. So it's not that God has averted the calamity away from me. It is that you are supposed to thank God that he took the calamity away from me and then brought it upon you. Or there's another dua that says that when you look at yourself in the mirror, you are supposed to thank God that you are beautiful and for making others ugly. So, we see a very hard deterministic concept in Islam. And the second of all is the negation of earlier scripture. That is, the Kutub contradicts Islam. When we say Kutub, what we mean is that the Torah, the Injil, and the Zabur, that's Arabic for the Gospels, the Psalms, and the Torah. Now, what he automatically says is that there are 6 articles of faith in Islam. You cannot believe 5 and not believe 1. You have to believe in the whole 6. And one of the 6 is simply that You must believe in the scriptures that had been revealed before, all right? In essence, you must believe in the Bible. And when we assess Islam, what Islam teaches, Islamic theology and so on and so forth, with what the Bible teaches, we see that there is a significant amount of contradiction. I'm not even talking textual contradiction. I'm talking contradiction in the message. When you see the Bible's message for mankind and you see the Quran's message for mankind, there is a significant amount of contradiction. So this renders Islam highly implausible. If there are questions in this regard, of course, they are welcome. And so this leaves us finally with the option of Christianity. Next slide. And very quickly, because I think I'm sensing my time is, rounding up. But very quickly, Pastor I.J. quoted C.S. Lewis not long ago. And if there's something I have read about 16th century history, particularly the history of Europe, it is that great figures of the world always have had the ability to recognize the significance of Jesus. For instance, we have W.H. Lecky, who wrote the History of European Morals, say that Jesus Christ is the most significant figure ever in the history of mankind. Napoleon also said something in this regard. Even, British historian H.G. Wells said something in this regard as well. But of course, what is this claim if, at the end of the day, the historical reliability of the New Testament is nothing to be found? So, first of all, I think I have 2 slides left and then I'm done. Now, if we are judging the historical reliability of the New Testament, I think the first thing we have to note is that we have to be conscious of presentism. That is, you cannot judge the ancient text by today's standard. Now, the Gospels are an ancient Greco-Roman biography, or they were written in the pattern of the ancient Greco-Roman biography. So it means that they were written in the 1st century by a 1st century author for a 1st century audience. So at least you must be charitable enough if you are to judge that particular genre by judging it by those ancient standards. And Mike Licona, a New Testament scholar, has done that. And he says that there are 4 certain criteria by which you can test the reliability of an ancient document. And when you compare the gospel, for instance, with the life of Augustus, written by Suetonius, it comes across as highly, highly reliable. But what if we decide to use modern criticism for the gospels? How well does it do? There are generally 3 criteria, which is bibliographical assessment, internal evidence, and external corroboration. And the New Testament does highly well in its reliability. Next slide. And Ian Sherwin White, who is a Roman historian, said, and I quote, "For the book of Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming, such that any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in the matters of detail, must now appear absurd." As for Dr. Clifford Wilson, former director of the Australian Institute of Archaeology, says those who know the facts now recognize that the New Testament must be accepted as a remarkably accurate source book. And then finally, William Ramsey, whose work I have read, says that Luke's history is unsurpassed in the respect of trustworthiness. Keep in mind that we're talking about the Gospels and Luke, mainly because those are where the historical information are mainly contained, as opposed to the epistles where you have Paul and Peter writing onto the church. These are letters, they're epistles. When we're talking about historical reliability, we're talking mainly about the Gospels and the New Testament. And we know that they are highly remarkable they're highly remarkable works. Now, finally, the next slide. Now, Pastor I.J. also mentioned something about, Jesus Christ resurrecting. And Paul hinges the validity of the faith on the fact that Jesus Christ resurrected. He says, if Jesus Christ be not raised from the dead, we are of all men miserable. And if Jesus Christ be not raised from the dead, then let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Now, there are several naturalistic explanations that have tried to, denigrate what the New Testament says about the resurrection, so to speak. Now, the first one is the hallucination hypothesis. And it's simply that all the disciples hallucinated what they saw. They saw the appearances of Jesus that they encountered were mere hallucinations. But this explanation is highly implausible, of course, because what psychologists, particularly clinical psychologists, have been able to demonstrate is that, of course, when you are bereaved and you hallucinate, this can only occur with one person. as opposed to occurring with not only one person, but over 500 brethren. And I'm not even talking Christian clinical psychologists admitting this. I'm talking atheistic and agnostic as well. So, or the stolen body hypothesis now, for instance. Of course, this is also inconsistent because we know that there were Roman guards stationed at the empty tomb. And, these guys were excellent killing machines. If the disciples had come and, attempted to steal, Jesus' body, all they would have to do is draw the sword and, hack and slash them. And then the swoon theory, or the apparent death theory, simply says that, Jesus Christ did not really die on the cross. That after he was taken down and taken to the tomb, somehow he got out miraculously. And then, after being lacerated and bleeding out, he would come on to the disciples, and then he would say he's resurrected. But I'm sorry, that makes absolutely no sense. Because when you see a man who has been, he's bleeding out and he's almost dead, the conclusion is not that this man has resurrected, but rather the conclusion is that he needs help, so to speak. Or the conspiracy hypothesis, or the displaced body hypothesis. Don't even get me started on the substitution theory. That's the Muslim theory that, it wasn't Jesus Christ that was crucified on the cross, but it was someone else that was crucified in his stead. I think you can find this in Quran chapter 4, verse 157. But all these theories have beat the dust, never to rise again. Pun intended. And finally, the next slide, or the last slide, will then be the inference, what I call the inference to the best explanation. And the idea is, what are the facts to be explained? The facts to be explained, and of course, when I say what are the facts, it means that these facts can be confirmed independently of the New Testament. If you were to look at other sources, whether Roman sources or Jewish sources, we can see these facts confirmed. And it is that 1, Jesus Christ was crucified. 2, the tomb was empty. And 3, the disciples had a transformative experience such as will give rise to Christianity that would later culminate to over 2 billion people who believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And like I said, of course, this can be confirmed independently of the Bible or of the New Testament. Now, the inference to the best explanation says, premise 1, X would be the state of affairs or body of facts and observation. The body of facts are simply the ones that I mentioned, that, the tomb was empty, Jesus Christ was crucified, the disciples had an experience. 2, Q would, if true, explain X. Now, if you look at the previous hypothesis that I posited, the alternative ones, there are several problems with this, and for the lack of time, I can really not expand on them. But if you apply this certain hypothesis to the inference to the best explanation, you will see that they fail woefully to explain the given body of facts. And then the third one would be premise 3. No other hypothesis can explain well as Q does. That is, there is no other hypothesis that can explain the given body of facts other than the fact that Jesus Christ resurrected and he rose from the dead. Therefore, with high probability, we can say the conclusion that Q is true, which is that given the body of facts, the best inference, or the inference to the best explanation, is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. That singular fact is what is congruent with the given body of facts that we have in our hands. Now, finally, before I give it to the next speaker, or before I call the next speaker, first of all, we've demonstrated through the Kalam cosmological argument and the Leibnizian cosmological arguments that the universe did indeed have a beginning and there was a cause. I corroborated this with the Big Bang theory, and I posted a caveat that we're not saying that the Big Bang theory shows that God exists, but the Big Bang theory demonstrates that the universe has a beginning. I also stated the problems with polytheism, and it brought us down to Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. I also highlighted some slight problems with Islam and with Judaism, and that leaves us with Christianity. I demonstrated that the historical reliability of the New Testament is sterling, and then I showed that Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead. Of course, there will be objections, but that's the inference that leads us to the best explanation. But when Jesus Christ was baptized by John, and we know that John himself is historical because we have citations of him in Josephus's work, the Antiquities of the Jews. John baptized Jesus, And scripture records that a voice came down from heaven saying, "This is my son in whom I'm well pleased." He says, "Hear ye him." Now, if we decide to listen to that advice that was made over 2,000 years ago by God himself, we would see, especially if we read the New Testament, that Jesus does indeed have a lot to say about our existential problem. There is no one that knows your heart and my heart the way Jesus Christ does. A certain ethicist says that if you were to condense all ethical philosophy and morals, it is a footnote compared to the Sermon of the Mount. It is a footnote compared to the Sermon of the Mount. All years of ethical philosophy. And so I think I would laud anybody here who is truly seeking that if you do decide to listen to what Jesus has to say, he has a lot to say about your existential problems, about the state of your heart. And of course, he made serious claims. He made bold claims. He made audacious claims. And matter of fact, that was why he had to die. But he rose again. And if somebody like that made such claims and he rose again, I think I would trust what he has to say.